It's pinned. I'll right click on the actual picture. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So this evening being the Uposatha, being the new moon, we are now a full month into the rainy season. So it's been a good time for us practicing out here in the woods. And tonight I thought I would offer a reflection about something which is actually fairly relevant both to lay people as to monastics, particularly a reflection on how we try to live our lives out here, but one that strikes to the very heart of the Buddhist teaching and its purpose, its goal, and the path to that goal. If one were to open up maybe like a high school textbook and look in the world religion section and see what they would say about Buddhism, it would probably be something quite brief. Oh, these are Buddhists, there's so many million in the world, and they believe that life is suffering, that desire is the cause of suffering, and they try to work to be free of desire. That's what you'll get. And that's extraordinarily simplistic, but it's not inaccurate. It's just, it's not that straightforward. Each of these things can be investigated. And that is the formula of the Four Noble Truths. Desire is the cause of our suffering. And many people don't get any further than that. They're like, okay, life is suffering. Not sure I agree with that. Desire is the cause of suffering. I like my desire. And why would I want to be free of it? That sounds like death. That sounds like annihilation. So I thought tonight to speak a little bit about desire and about a healthy approach to goal setting, because this is very important to the practice. If one just reads a little blurb, well, okay, yeah, that's what Buddhism is technically. If one investigates any of those points, then one finds it's much deeper. So life isn't suffering in and of itself. It has suffering, a suffering that can't be completely removed out of the equation, because we grow old and we die. We lose the things that we love. So yeah, there's suffering. So setting that aside, there is desire. I don't think anybody would really argue that there's desire. Yeah, of course, we want things. That's obvious. Some people would maybe argue that desire causes suffering. And therein we have the difficulty and why it's important to investigate, not just take it at face value. Because the word desire is being applied in many different situations. And this is a translation error. There are many different concepts like raga or Taṇha or chanda that are all getting translated as desire. And it leads to a basic confusion about what it is we're doing. But to demystify it a little, we are in fact working for the end of desire. That is the goal, because desire does produce suffering. But now, which desire out of those three am I talking about? Well, the raga and the Taṇha, but not the chanda. And that's something that's harder to explain, and fewer people investigate far enough to get to this understanding, is that the very basis of walking the Buddha's path requires a form of desire. and that form of desire is not unwholesome. It doesn't need to be annihilated. It doesn't even need to be resisted. It's useful. There is a wholesome form of desire. So that's why the word desire can't be universally applied, to all of these different words. Now there's the other forms of desire, raga or lust, and tanha or thirst. Now these, people would be like, okay, yeah, I can see how I might not want thirst. I might not want lust. So that's where we get into the things that need to be let go of. And the distinction I often have found is that there is desire that produces suffering, and there is desire that is produced by suffering. And this is a really quick way to see which of the two desires we have arising in any given moment. The desire which produces suffering, of course, that is thirst. And it comes from a sense of lack. There is a basic idea whenever we want something external to ourselves, is that we aren't happy now. And getting something external will make us happy. Or holding on to something external will make us happy. And that this is, in a way, a burning in the heart. Sometimes, it's hard to see. It's hard to see how our wanting can actually be painful. But that's the reality of it. This wanting automatically puts us in debt, because it comes from the idea that we don't already have what we need. And that something else can provide what we need. Then there is suffering, which comes, or desire, which comes from suffering. And this is, I say, is chanda. And this is not dangerous. It's not burning, because while it does motivate us, it's coming from our needs. We're hungry, or we're cold, or we're hot, or we're lonely, or we're lost. We have a form of suffering that has arisen, and because of that suffering, conditioned by that suffering, we'll seek a relief of that suffering. The reason this is not to be feared is because this form of desire ends with the relief of that suffering. When the cause of that desire ceases, that desire ceases. The other one, it doesn't cease. If you have a thirst for external pleasures, or an anger, a resentment, you just see how the mind will move from one object to the next. It'll get what it wants. And then there'll be a little bit of satiation. There'll be a little bit of, okay, yeah, that was what I wanted. But it won't be long before that thirst is back and it wants something else. But in order to walk the path, we have to recognize that, yeah, there is suffering in life. And we have to allow it to motivate us. And this is where seeing the use of desire allows us to properly set our goals, properly set our compass for what it is we really want to put energy into. There's one famous simile that was used by the Venerable Ananda, the Buddha's attendant. After the Buddha had passed away, he was approached by somebody. And this person asked, I hear that you guys are all about the end of suffering, or the end of desire. You want to cut desire out. But how could it be that you desire the end of suffering? Isn't that a form of desire? And normally you'd be like, oh, yeah, I guess we messed up. But no, Ananda said, well, okay, so it's like this. Suppose it were a really hot day. And you had the thought, maybe I could go to a park, and that park would be cool and shady, and I would be relaxed. So you've got a form of suffering, the suffering of it's too hot. And you have a possible solution to that suffering, but it's going to take work. But you do the work. You gather your family, you get your carriages ready, you set a time and a destination, you head out there. And when you arrive at the park, you dismount and you go into the shade, and it's cool. And so you do the work. And then when you're in the park, Ananda said, do you desire, I want to go to the park? And the person he was talking to said, well, no, if I'm in the park, then I don't desire to go to the park because I'm already there. Of course. And Ananda said, of course. Likewise, when you are not yet free of suffering, you can desire the end of suffering. But once you reach the end of suffering, that desire will cease. It comes from our current condition, and it drives us onward. It helps us set goals. You know, I'm suffering. I'm suffering from the other kind of desire, the thirst, the lust, the passion, the sense of lack. This is burning me, and I want to be free of that burning. And so we can form chanda, we can form interest and zeal. You know, I want to strive. I want to get over this. I want to figure this out. We do work. There is some work. You know, nobody's going to quickly get to that goal without, you know, practicing effort and mindfulness and concentration, and without letting go of bad habits and developing good habits. That takes some energy, it takes some work. But once they do that work and they arrive at their destination, they realize they don't have the pain of thirst, the pain of tanha, the pain of desire. Well, then they're not suffering. And because they're not suffering, there's no need to seek an end of suffering. They find the peace that they're looking for, and desire just disappears. And this is maybe some people really resist this notion. Because yeah, it's easy to think of desire in terms of external objects. Yeah. Oh, I want a cup of coffee, or oh, I want to live somewhere nice. Yeah, you know, we all think of desire in those terms, but in my own experience, that's only a portion of our desires in life. The really tricky desires, it turns out, are the desires for desire itself. And I ask you, is that something that you experience? You know, because I definitely, I'm just like almost every week I have somebody asking me, like, don't I need desire? And I say, yes, but now let's unpack that. You know, an interest, you know, is going to naturally arise. It helps you decide what you want to do in life. But do you need thirst? Do you need craving? Do you need passion? No. No, you don't. And in fact, that's what we're doing. We're trying to overcome these things. We're trying to learn to live without these things. And this is hard for people to accept, the difference, because it does seem like a sort of annihilation, doesn't it? What would I be without desire? Would I would be like a person without a skeleton, would just kind of just melt, you know, and just be a blob. I wouldn't get up in the morning. I wouldn't do anything. I wouldn't take delight in anything. And yet, if you ever meet somebody who's been practicing for a long time, you meet somebody who's quite energetic. Somebody who would just build a monastery, just up and do it. And they do it well. They do it quickly and efficiently. Why? Well, because there's no delusion in the way. The forest master Ajahn Chah was once asked by someone, is it possible for arahants, for enlightened beings, to learn? And Ajahn Chah looked at them. And the idea is pretty straightforward. It's like once we reach the end of karma, the end of generating karma, are we fixed in time? Do we stop developing as a person once we get rid of desire? And Ajahn Chah looked at them and they're like, no. Once you're an arahant, you begin learning. Everything before that is just mixed in with delusion. It's mixed in with ignorance. You're learning, but you're only half learning. The other half is picking up bad habits that have to get distilled back out. But when you are free of all of the unwholesome form of desire, then there is just a purified sense of what it is you actually want to be doing in any given moment. You're not burned by that. It's just a simple sort of motivation, but very interestingly, and why I say it's very applicable to what we're doing as monastics, is because it has to be allowed to arise on its own. And that's the difference. And that's why I say the desire for desire is perhaps the more insidious kind of desire. You have kama tanha, kama raga, and the desire for external objects. But then we have bhava tanha and vibhava tanha, the desire simply to exist. And this is a hard desire to understand and to combat, because doesn't everybody want to exist? But if that sounds like a paradox, I ask you to consider, if you didn't want to exist, if you didn't desire existence, would you at that moment stop existing? I mean, you just think to your own experience. Have you ever seen anybody wink out of existence because they stopped desiring existence? Do people do that? The guy next to you just poof. You're like, oh no, he gave up desire. Whoa, good for him, but not yet. I don't think I'm ready for that yet. No, it's just not the way it works. As it turns out, our existence is not conditioned by our desire for existence. In fact, our desire for existence is a form of confusion. There's no threat to existence. I mean, the world exists whether or not we want it to. So that our desire isn't actually adding anything to the scenario except suffering. So what would it be to let go of that? Well, maybe, yeah, at first we have to take something that seems like a very rational way to move forward, that I should seek to exist and to be a person and to think about my personality and my development and what I want and where I'm going and my 5-year plan, and just let that kind of settle. Like, oh, okay, well, that's all well and good, but can I let it go? Because it hurts. This is a form of suffering, of thirst. It implies that there's a lack there, that all of these things come about because of all the effort I need to put into them, that they won't come about if I don't force myself to think about it. We experience this every time we sit down on the meditation cushion. Our minds are actually churning out taṇha, churning out desires all the time. And we're nurturing half of them. So it seems like a good idea. It seems necessary. Even once the external desires, the desire to get things, have settled, still there's this restlessness in the mind. We think we're supposed to be doing something. We're supposed not to be doing something. And these are more subtle forms of desire. We can let these settle, then we may actually come to an experience where we can see what it is that we really want. And I say what we really want because if we allow all of the thirst that comes from an idea of lack to cease, then we will see where we are actually suffering, where in our lives we're genuinely suffering. One example of this is hunger. So most people in the developed modern world don't often experience hunger. They eat before they're hungry. That makes sense. Hunger is painful, right? So they don't want to experience pain, and they just eat 3 meals a day. We're here and we eat, sometimes 1 meal a day. And when you do that, you experience hunger. But it's very interesting that we tend to really, we know when we're hungry, and we know that our hunger is motivating us to seek food. And so there's no confusion about the matter, and there's no need for Taṇha to arise, because the suffering is right there. Oh, I'm hungry, I'll go eat. There was once a Chinese master who was approached, and somebody said, how do I practice Dharma? And he said, when you're hungry, eat. When you're tired, sleep. That's it. That's the scenario, yeah? That's the easiest set of instructions you'll find, because that set of instructions allows for both. It's like, you can have aspirations, you can have goals, but let them come from the suffering that's actually arising in your life. Let it be motivated by what's actually happening to you, and seek a solution to problems that you actually have, rather than problems that you think you'll have, or problems that you're creating. So we, as monastics, we are practicing, we're actually trying to put this into effect. So the Buddha created a structure where somebody can step out of the flow of lay life, out of the flow of the householder life. And it's not because being a householder is bad, but that there are a lot of elements within having a household that require us to work in a very like creating a self kind of way. We need to work hard to protect things, to have financial security, to have food security, to have everything, relationship security, people to look after us, when we get old and frail. We're doing all of these things based on, putting ourselves into the future and anticipating our problems. Being a monastic is just us stepping to the side and saying, well, okay, what would happen if I let that settle and I were to just wake up in the morning and I see what are the simplest possible desires that could arise? Well, we'll wake up, we'll get hungry, we'll need to use the bathroom, we'll probably want to do a bit of exercise, and then we'll get tired, and then we'll go to sleep. And that's the bare minimum, yeah? We have what are called the 4 requisites. So clothing, food, shelter, and medicine. The thing about these is you can form a wholesome desire for these things when the need arises. Clothing, when you're cold, you can seek more clothing. And once you put it on, you don't need more clothing because you're suddenly warm. The desire ceases as the suffering ceases. When you're hungry, you seek food, but food isn't good in and of itself. I usually like 1 ice cream cone is great. 2 ice cream cones, yeah, so it's okay. It's okay. 3, okay, that's getting gross. 4 is like a torture, and that's the reality. Food is not good in and of itself. It is a tool for helping cure the suffering of hunger. But once you have cured that suffering, hopefully the desire, the chanda, the interest in that object can cease. We can let it cease. You say, okay, this is a beautiful object, but it's beautiful because of its usefulness, its ability to fix a problem, not in and of itself. In and of itself, it's just milk kind of whipped up in a particular form, and it'll melt and it'll turn into a puddle, and it's not that pretty anymore anyway. Shelter, once you have enough shelter, you can know I have enough shelter. But then as a layperson, that's hard to find, isn't it? We're always trying to think, well, shouldn't I seek something better? Shouldn't I seek something nicer, cleaner, bigger? And it's a slippery slope. So we're homeless. We don't technically own any shelter, at the moment. Somebody could offer us something, and we have certain ways that we can receive that. But as a monastic, we would probably still come and go from that place, because just having shelter doesn't fix our problems in terms of spiritual practice. It just puts a roof over our heads. But it's still up to us to do useful things for our benefit within that shelter. So if we're given a shelter and we use it to meditate and to study and to learn the Buddha's teachings, to overcome Taṇha, well, then that shelter is going to good use. But if we use it to just go into hibernation and just be in a sleeping bag 23 hours a day, well, then I'd say that shelter is not going to particularly good use. And it would be okay if somebody came along and said, yeah, why don't you move along? Because maybe we would do better in some other scenario. And so that's why we're practicing this way of being homeless, because we would actually want that. The suffering of being exposed to the elements is one kind of suffering, and we can know and we can deal with it. But there are other kinds of suffering that are deeper, more pervasive. The suffering of the fact that we're getting older, suffering of the fact that one day we will die, the suffering that we're going to lose the things that we love, and that we're going to be exposed to things that we won't love. Now, these are kinds of suffering that we can really use to orient ourselves. So there's a teaching of the Buddha that deals with this, that deals with how we set goals. And it's maybe a talk all in and of itself, but it's called the Iddhipada. And Iddhi in the time of the Buddha was psychic powers. And so there was this set of teachings for how to develop psychic powers. And nowadays people would be like, what? But back in the day, when people actually had and used psychic powers and believed in psychic powers, they were pretty interested in learning how to do it. Nowadays, people don't believe in psychic powers, and they don't get to see people using psychic powers, so they aren't very interested in it. They don't see it as a solution to any of their problems. And over the course of history, psychic powers have created just as many problems as they have solved. But nevertheless, the Buddha put down this set of teachings called the Iddhipada for people who wanted to develop their mind. But it's also, interestingly, in Buddhist countries, this is a teaching that's used for any kind of goal setting. And the Iddhipada is the steps to success, as it's possible to translate them, would be chanda, or interest, what we've been talking about, energy, focus, and then review. So 4 aspects really of coming to understand what it is that motivates us and how well we're moving towards the solution, how well we're setting these goals. So chanda, as we've been describing, is knowing what's an actual useful source of motivation, one that's going to lead us to happiness, to actual happiness. we could sit down and be like, okay, I want $1 million. But where does that come from? Is that going to solve our problems? So learning to orient ourselves in terms of chanda is, well, what is the problem here? Where is the suffering? It's like, okay, well, the suffering might be, I need enough money to pay my bills. Well, yeah, if you had $1 million, you'd be able to pay your bills, right? But isn't that, 2 steps? Isn't that kind of a roundabout way of paying your bills? Why don't you seek to pay your bills? Because that's a known suffering, the suffering of having bills to pay. And if you just seek to pay your bills, well, then that's a much more straightforward goal to set than I want $1 million. And yet the lottery is still a thriving business, isn't it? Because people are seeking to win it big in the lottery to solve their problems. So they're trying to solve their problems, but they're doing it in a roundabout way. Likewise, if we're trying to figure out, where we want to live, I want to live somewhere nice and spacious and comfortable and with good people. But as monastics, we're encouraged to be like, well, what is shelter for? What is the actual need? Like, oh, well, I need a place where I can sleep. I need a place that's a shelter for me and my family. I need a place that isn't filled with mold. We can adjust our goals based on what we're actually facing. And while it might sound boring, because there's no seeking a mansion in that scenario, because nobody really needs a mansion, as it turns out, it can actually be a very beautiful way to live. And you don't have to be a monastic to start thinking in those terms. And so you're like, well, I have these sufferings, and shelter, the right kind of shelter, can fix these sufferings. But then if you get the right kind of shelter such that you're not suffering in that way anymore, then you can be content, you can be happy, and you can be free of desire. Now, I don't say automatically, because that would be the realization of nibbana. That would be the realization of spiritual freedom. If you just got the right shelter, and you didn't have any desire to be living in a mansion or to be having a swimming pool or this or that or the other thing, well, then you would be totally free. It's something to look at and something to consider and aspire towards. Is there a way of, before we set our goals, stopping and properly orienting ourselves, asking, like, what is the actual problem that I am trying to solve? Getting down to the core of it. And finding that problem, which is coming from a suffering that we actually have, a need that we actually have. And then we can just move towards that goal. The same way, in a metta sense, for the Buddhist path, we have this suffering of aging, sickness, and death. We have this suffering of loss, the suffering of all the suffering that we cause ourselves from desire. And we can seek an end to that. We say, okay, yes. So if I wanted to be free of the suffering coming from unwholesome desire, how would I do that? Now, how we've tried to do it statistically, universally in the past, is by getting things, trying to solve our desires by getting the thing that we desire. And yet that hasn't worked for us. But if we look at what the actual problem is, then maybe we can turn it around and say, oh, well, I'm desiring this because of this. There is this pain in my life. There is this need in my life. And is that something that can be solved? If it is something that can be solved, then we can set our goals and we can move in that direction. If it is something that can't be solved, like nobody's going to live forever, nobody's done it yet, then we know that this is it's not a goal that we need to have even. It's not a useful goal to set, to be free of getting old and dying. That's why we have the noble truths. They help teach us, where our energy is best put. So these are some thoughts I'm offering tonight, hopefully to get some gears turning in the mind. There are so many things that we seek, and I think often I see people are they're trying to get something, but they haven't asked themselves why they're trying to get it. They haven't seen the extra steps they're taking. They have a legitimate problem, but maybe the solution they're trying to apply to that problem is convoluted. They're seeking a better job, but they never ask themselves why they're seeking a better job. If it's something as simple as the guy next to them is really annoying in their office, well, getting another job will solve their problem, but actually, so would moving over to the next desk. Yeah. Do we try to solve our problems in a convoluted way because of Taṇha? Or do we know our problems and find the most effective solution to them? And once we start to analyze this, we can start to actually move in that direction of only having wholesome desires. And when all of our problems are in any given moment solved, having no desires at all. And that isn't annihilation. That is the opposite of annihilation. That is a perfectly happy human being. And that is something worth seeking. It doesn't happen by accident, in my experience. It happens by putting in the conditions and figuring these things out. But should you put in the conditions, it will feel like a coincidence. It will feel like a fortuitous accident when it does happen, because it's hard to plan for the end of needs. Nevertheless, if we keep putting in the conditions, that day will arrive, and then we'll find ourselves complete, because that's what we are without thirst, without a sense of lack, intrinsically complete. And so on this evening, I offer these thoughts for your reflection.
Namayang Dhammakataya Sadhu Karang Dhammasi Sadhu Sadhu Sadhu